As for the next speaker, it's my pleasure to introduce. So he's a person who's known to almost all of you, probably personally as well as professionally. Professor Sandy Mcfarlane is the Director of the University of Adelaide Centre for Traumatic Stress Studies. He's an international expert in the field of disasters, military mental health and PTSD. He's recipient of a number of awards, including the Lifetime Achievement Award of the ISTSS, and also as the lead on the seminal 2010 Defence Mental Health Prevalence Study, and in that context also senior advisor to DVA and Defence over many years. He's published over 350 articles and chapters and co-edited 3 books, and in 2011 received the Officer of the Order of Australia Award for his contribution to the field. Please welcome Professor Sandy Mcfarlane.
Thank you very much, David, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Minister Tien, I'd like to particularly acknowledge your presence and thank you for your leadership and support for the work that's being done in this field. And I'd also like to thank Tony Dell very much for his leadership in calling this symposium. Now, what I'm going to talk about today is the prolonged and unanticipated consequence of traumatic stress. And in doing this, I thought I'd reflect a little about my own career and the importance of an organisation like PTS17. I think it's very easy looking back to think, well, we've actually come a long way and we've achieved a great amount. And I think it's important not to underplay our achievements. But I think it's always very dangerous to be complacent. And I think one of the important reflections is, well, you know, what have I changed my mind about in the course of my career? And what are the areas which I think still require a lot of attention? And that's what I'd like to reflect upon this morning. And my career obviously started after the catastrophic bushfires in South Australia, and I followed a number of populations over a 9-year period, and actually one population we're still following up, children who are now adults. Now, I think one of the lessons that possibly we've learnt more about in the passage of time than we often acknowledge is that there are many individuals who cope at the time of stress but become unwell many years later. But I think we've been very reluctant to actually accept this, and one of the reasons is that we really actually haven't a model of psychopathology that explains this. And I think this has got a deep sort of historical origin, which I'd like to reflect on. And I think it's very timely because, in fact, at the present time, it's a century since the Battle of Passchendaele, which was really one of the truly major campaigns of the AIF in the First World War. And at the time of the First World War, it was fascinating how there was really virtually no preparation for the idea that there were going to be psychiatric casualties. There were approximately 10% of battlefield casualties at the beginning of the war were of a mental nature. And the interesting thing is that at the time, the medical corps were really blamed for this because there was a fight between the neurologist and the psychiatrist as to what was the cause, and there was this popular notion of shell shock. And it was largely attributed at the beginning of the war to being an issue of suggestion. In other words, there really wasn't anything wrong with these people. It was just they were looking for a way of getting out of battle. As time went on, statistics were being collected, and here we have some figures from the Battle of Passchendaele where you can see that there are very significant rises in the number of cases at the time of the fighting being its most ferocious. And one of the solutions that they adopted was actually not to diagnose people, and you can see the title NYDN, which is not yet diagnosed, was the term that was used. It was thought that if you gave it a name, you created the problem. And the solution that was introduced with the casualties who broke down in battle was essentially forward treatment. Now, forward treatment was a very important innovation, and there are a number of studies which have shown that it has had impacts on long-term disability. And it's basically the PIES model: proximity, immediacy, expectancy, and simplicity. But the interesting issue that retrospectively going back and looking at this, Edgar Jones, who's a British medical historian, and his colleagues have really shown that in fact its effectiveness was very significantly conflated. In fact, only about 20% of those who were treated in that way ever returned effectively to frontline roles. The other side of the equation is that there were, however, a recognition that there were a number of people who broke down in battle who in fact occurred after prolonged demonstration of bravery and capacity in the battlefield, but ultimately this issue of cumulative exposure was a significant contributor. But this was really minimised in the literature at the time. So everybody expected once the war was over that there weren't going to be any long-term problems, because really this was a problem about the breakdown in battle. If you treated people at the front, everything would be done and dusted and everybody would be fine. Well, probably one of the best statistics that actually demonstrates that this wasn't the case was figures from the US Veterans Administration, which basically showed with the passage of time there was an increasing number of people who were presenting to the Veterans Affairs hospitals with psychiatric disorders. And a reflection of this in 1945 was Grinker, who's a very well-respected American psychiatrist, who, looking back over the period from after the First World War, basically summarised how their astonishment was how many of the people who were hospitalised, you've got to remember this was during the Second World War, it's a very long time after the First World War, were in fact people had broken down once they'd returned to the US. So, and the word astonishment, I think, summarises the issue that they really didn't have a way of understanding why on earth this was going on. And the prevailing model of psychiatry at the time was that of the psychoanalytic model. And really they attributed the problem with these soldiers, it wasn't due to the combat exposure that they'd had, but rather due to their 40 personality structure. It was really that whole issue that early childhood development determined your adult mental health, and adult experience had very little impact. And this was really, I think, very stigmatising and to the detriment of those people who'd had these extraordinary combat exposures and had become unwell. And the way this was sort of conceptualised in a longitudinal perspective, that, you know, if you broke down during the war, there was this feeling that it was all to do with suggestion, malingering and cowardice. And once the war was over, it was seen to be exaggerated disability. And in fact, the word that was used in the 1930s was really compensation neurosis. So if we summarise that, you know, the conceptualisation as a consequence of the First World War was that it really was an acute problem, and the issue was you provided acute intervention, and the way that you dealt with the problem was to minimise the use of diagnosis. And these people were really very highly stigmatised. And the predominant cause of this was vulnerability. Now, one of the reasons why I think it's worth reflecting on this is that we often talk about the stigma of post-traumatic stress disorder. And I think the important issue is that many of those beliefs still remain within our society at various levels. And one place I think they particularly remain alive is within the compensation sector. And one interesting reflection on this was the Victorian Ombudsman conducted an inquiry into workers' compensation management of cases, and was published in September 2016. And it basically summarised how it remains the case that many of the compensation agents will very actively choose evidence that really contradicts the overriding opinions and body of information supporting a claim, and will actively choose to negate individuals' compensation claims. And they reflected on how, you know, there are many seriously injured workers, and here we're often talking about emergency service personnel who basically are being sort of hounded by the system, and these are very vulnerable people who suffer greatly as a consequence. And one of the important findings of the Senate and House of Representatives Committee that was just published in August was basically that there remains an issue within DVA about the attitudes of some of the people managing the compensation claims. And I think one of the things that we have to face is that some of those people come from the state compensation systems and bring these attitudes with them. So that I think there is a very significant issue for us to ensure that, you know, the information that we have about psychological injuries is dealt with in a more reasoned way within the compensation sector if we really are going to address the issue of stigma in society. And this really is, I think, a long and lasting legacy of what happened in the First World War. So the Second World War came along, and what happened? Well, the first thing was, obviously, you can continue to get your psychiatric casualties of war. The fascinating thing is that everybody had forgotten all the lessons of the First World War, and it took them about a year to re-congregate their units for the forward treatment of psychiatry, and again that's reflected in this slide here, showing that the whole idea was that you basically rested the soldier and then got them back into combat. But as Albert Glass, who wrote the report for the American Armed Forces on the impact of the Second World War, reflected in this wonderful chapter he wrote in 1974, after the war, exactly the same thing happened all over again. They basically blamed the soldier about it being personality defects, the idea that cumulative exposure had an impact or was a significant cause was minimised, and essentially the issues of stigma remained. Another very important issue just to remember was, for example, in the Air Force in the Second World War, if you couldn't survive your 30 flights, which were tour of duty and bomber command, basically the diagnosis was LMF, which is basically lack of moral fibre. And you can see, again, that is a highly stigmatising term. If you couldn't complete your tour of duty, you're essentially stripped of rank and dishonourably discharged. So these attitudes in our society are very deeply rooted, and I think we should not forget that. Now, the whole focus and the understanding of the importance of acute reactions as being the core of the effect of traumatic events was really embedded within the systems of diagnosis. DSM-1 called it gross stress reaction. DSM-2, which you've got to remember was obviously aggregated in the middle of the Vietnam War, it was called adjustment reaction. Now, one of the really interesting parts about this story was that, in fact, in 1890, Oppenheim, a German neurologist, had coined the term traumatic neurosis, and it was one that attracted a great deal of interest in the psychiatric community. But that term was basically rejected at a conference in 1916 by a very influential group of German psychiatrists because they saw it was a diagnosis that was basically undermining the morale of the German nation. It was nothing to do with the science. And it's intriguing how readily that influenced the English-speaking psychiatric community, although there had been a very substantial body of research and knowledge establishing the utility of that construct. So what happens? We obviously are in the middle of the Vietnam War, and the whole effort there was put into frontline psychiatry. And it was also thought that if you limited a tour of duty to a year, you would limit the exposures. And Albert Glass, who so insightfully had summarised the problems of what had happened in the First and the Second World War, believed that because that forward psychiatry effort was so much better coordinated and run, there wasn't going to be any long-term problem. And you can see this really highlights how the whole notion was that if people didn't have acute symptoms, they would remain well. Now, we all know the story. A generation of American servicemen and Australian servicemen. I think it's also important to remember this, the country that had the second highest number of combatants from the Allies was actually the Koreans. They had 3.5 million 350,000 personnel who served in Vietnam. And now, interestingly, those Vietnam veterans joined forces with the women, and particularly women who had been the victims of domestic violence and rape, and were supported by a group of advocate psychiatrists. And it was their influence that really led to DSM-3 adopting the term post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, one of the fascinating things about that was that the medical establishment in the US was very reluctant to use that. And one example of that was that in the Department of Veterans Affairs hospitals in the US, they have a grant system to encourage people to remain working within that system if they have some academic aspirations. And there was a grant round, and many people put in grants to study PTSD, and not a single one of them was awarded. And essentially these two gentlemen, Senators Cranston and Inouye, both who were World War II veterans, Inouye, as you can see, is of Japanese descent. He was an Hawaiian senator, and he'd fought in the Japanese battalion in Europe, which had received some of the highest battle citations, and he actually lost his arm in battle. Now, they basically took on the Veterans Affairs Administration, and it led to the Vietnam Veterans Readjustment Study, which actually couldn't be conducted by anybody who had any relationship with the Veterans Affairs system. And what it showed when it was published in 1990, there was this significant long-term cost of fighting in war, and that basically around 9% of those who'd served in Vietnam continued to have a post-traumatic stress disorder. And that was an absolute game changer. And I think one of the important points to make here is that it demonstrates that research in this field is absolutely critical to establishing the validity and the attention of those in decision-making positions and leading to effective change. And I think it's one of the reasons why the research program which the Minister spoke of is so important in really formulating future service delivery and direction in Australia. And it's why it's so important in Australia that the Defence and DVA have funded these research programs. So let's talk about the importance of the longitudinal course, because I think you can see it's what the field has really struggled to understand. Now, we've been very fortunate in Australia to have had long-term funding by this collaborative of researchers, and David Forbes and Megan O'Donnell have been very much involved in it. And we've done this study over 6 years of accident victims admitted to a number of teaching hospitals around Australia. Now, when you look at the first stages of this study, you might believe the story about acute stress disorder. If you come into a hospital and after an accident you develop an acute stress disorder in a year, there's about a 45% you'll have the diagnosis of having a PTSD. So that shows if you do have a high level of acute symptoms, you really are significantly at risk. And that really is the story that we've heard before about acute combat stress reactions. If we, however, look at the people who finish up with a PTSD at 12 months, basically the significant majority of them, in the order of 70%, do not have acute symptoms. They don't have an acute stress disorder. And you can see that's the problem, that the bulk of the people who finish up with emerging disorder have seemingly coped well at the time. So whilst people who have an acute stress disorder are at much greater risk, the majority who develop PTSD don't have an acute stress disorder. And I think that is the issue that historically people have had so much difficulty understanding. Now, what happens if we follow these people with the passage of time? And Bob Ursano showed this slide. And you can see if we follow these people over 6 years, the most common pattern of symptoms in these people are the people who have increasing symptoms with time, having had relatively little symptoms acutely, these two groups here. And you can see they make up respectively 10 and 8%. So there's 18% of those people. So that is actually the most common pattern. And that's not the way we think about it. We think about what trauma does is cause severe acute symptoms that tend to improve with time. Well, in this population, that certainly isn't the case. Now, is that an unusual characteristic associated with this group? And I'll address that in a moment. Now, the important issue is if we go back and look at this population in detail, and if we look at them at 24 months, if you've got a PTSD at 24 months, 3 months after the event, still at that point, about 44% of them have minimal symptoms. When we get down to 12 months, still around a quarter of them have minimal symptoms, and only half of them will have reached a full diagnosis. And this really highlights this issue. There's this progressive emergence of symptoms with time. Now, the reason why this is important is if you're going to put your efforts into prevention, when are you going to do it? And what does it mean about treatment? Now, this question about is that isolated to this group? Well, here we have the follow-up of the Vietnam Veterans Readjustment Study, who were followed up 25 years after the first wave, and you can see that 16% have had an increase in their symptoms with time, whereas only 7% have had a decrease. So in that cohort, we've very much got that pattern of continued increasing symptomatic severity with time. The Millennium Cohort Study, which looked at as following 100,000 US personnel over 30 years. So a number of them where they had a pre-deployment data point and 2 data points post-deployment. And again, you can see of those who are symptomatic, by far the most common pattern is this one of increasing symptoms with time. So this demonstrates that in military personnel, we also observe this. And I think it's one of the reasons why the transition study, which the Minister mentioned, is so important, because what it's doing is actually looking at, well, what are the trajectories of symptom development once people are discharged from the military? So I think we can see that there's really a very substantial body of evidence about how, with the passage of time, many people become unwell who've coped acutely. And in fact, the way the whole problem was conceptualised historically really did not understand the problem. And I think has led to many erroneous views in terms of views of stigma. So I think another issue that's related to this is this whole issue about cumulative trauma exposure. I think one of the challenges of the diagnostic criteria, they make us think about the impact of a single event on somebody's adaptation rather than about what happens with the cumulative burden of trauma. And in the mental health prevalence study, where we captured some 24,000 people, we're able to look at how many symptoms will you like to have as your number of trauma exposures increased. And you can see here that these different colours about low, moderate, high and very high symptoms. The more trauma exposures you have, the more likely you are to get symptoms. So basically people don't get used to this. The cumulative burden of stress exposure is a critical issue about risk. And there's some very important neurobiological studies, one just published this last week, which shows that in military populations, your cumulative trauma exposure, independent of whether you have PTSD or not, is associated with significant loss of cortical thickness. So there's a neurological scar that goes with this. And I think this really highlights the issue that we possibly should be thinking about PTSD as a sensitisation disorder. And this is really about your increasing reactivity to stress the more exposure you have, which you can represent schematically in this diagram, because essentially it's about the loss of regulation and the loss of homeostasis, the loss of down-regulation mechanisms, the more times you get exposed to trauma. And underpinning this, there is a very substantial body of neurobiology, and I haven't got time to go into this, and Bob Osano touched on some of the important areas. And I think increasingly what we need to recognise that PTSD is actually a systemic disorder where there is dysregulation of brain physiology, but also of systemic physiology in areas like inflammation. PTSD is associated with an increased risk, for example, of autoimmune disease. It also has an increased mortality. So let's have a look and see how we have adapted to this knowledge with the passage of time. Now, when I was involved after the Ash Wednesday bushfires, this is a photograph I took at the time where I was accompanying Beverly Raphael, and we were going around debriefing various communities. This is taken from the Tarpina Community Hall. Now, one of the things we now know is that debriefing really has no evidence about its effectiveness in the aftermath of disasters. And I think one of the great achievements that's happened in Australia is the treatment guidelines that have been developed by Phoenix Australia. And they have a specific section in there, for example, about emergency service personnel. And I think the support for the development of these treatment guidelines has set some benchmarks for what should be put in place in clinical practice. Despite that, however, the Country Fire Service in South Australia has just got a tender out, which is virtually for a service provider to provide debriefing for their Country Fire Service personnel after disasters, which is, as we can see, there's no evidence base for it. And really what we need to be thinking about with firefighters is the cumulative risk, as shown by this study which was done by Sam Harvey with the New South Wales Police Force. And you can see that if the number of fatalities that the number of fatalities that a fire officer has been exposed to significantly predict a range of adverse outcomes. And I think this is really one of the challenges that we face is, well, how do we treat the people who've had one or two exposures differently from those people who've had multiple trauma exposures? And the reason why this is an important question is a recent meta-analysis of psychological interventions in military populations showed that whilst there are very significant treatment gains with trauma-based psychotherapies, you still have about 60% to 70% of people left with their diagnosis. Now, if you had cardiac disease and you went along to a cardiologist and you're left with angina, you wouldn't be happy. And I think we really need to focus on the fact that whilst we've made some substantial gains in treatment, we have much to do. Now, where does this leave us? I think one of the problems is that there are many forces at play in Australia, and why I think Stand Tall is such an important organisation, which are really, I think, disrupting the development of services. Now, and I don't think we can just sort of point the finger at the administrators. I mean, one of the other interesting things is that the quality of research isn't necessarily getting better. I mean, I've been around for long enough to people to be publishing studies where I'll review them and they say this has never been done before, and you could quote 4 or 5 papers where it has been done before. And this is shown in this study that was done by Fran Norris, where she reviewed the disaster research over the previous 25 years. And you can see as time goes on, studies are more likely to be cross-sectional than longitudinal. Now, the importance of that is they're going to miss these long-term follow-up effects. They're going to focus on the acute symptoms and really miss the story that I've been talking about today. And so that, one of the difficulties is that I think we're at a point where we're tending to lose some knowledge and information that we've learned along the way. And I think this sort of research highlights the importance of having long-term cohorts. And that's one of the reasons why I think the research program, the Deployment Health Surveillance program that's been set up by the Defence Force and DVA is so important into the long term, because I think we've got much to learn, and it's only when that sort of research is funded, which requires an enormous commitment and coordination, that we'll really learn the lessons. So just getting back to this issue about the challenges in service delivery and sustaining quality. Now, one of the things that I think we have to face is that the sale and the loss of the Veterans Affairs hospitals in Australia has been the loss of, I think, a very critical body of expertise, both in terms of opportunities for training and culture carriers. And I think a real issue is also the fragmentation of services at a state level. And I think one of the things that we really require is a public health policy for health service delivery of how we deal with the effects of traumatic events. Because the problem is we've got multiple uncoordinated funding streams. I mean, in Australia, the 3 emergency services are seldom under the same direction. They're not coordinated with the services for victims of crime, etc. And I think one of the other things that we don't have is we don't have a coordinated network of centres of excellence that ensure treatment developments and knowledge are integrated into service delivery. And I think one of the real problems is that state governments have a real conflict of interest. I mean, tragically, there have been significant legislative changes where workers' compensation entitlements have been wound back. For example, in South Australia, if you're an emergency service person, you only get 2 years cover for workers' compensation, which is in complete contrast to the veterans community. So on one hand, you've got the governments in states trying to limit their responsibilities under the motor accident victim legislation and under work cover. They're also the employees of the police, fire and ambulance personnel, yet they're trying to provide services for victims of crime, child abuse and disasters, and there's absolutely no integration of this. And I think there's really a lack of leadership in this domain at a state-based level. And I think the Commonwealth should be worried about this, because we're limiting their access to treatment under workers' compensation. The Commonwealth is picking up the cost, so it's really cost-shifting par excellence. And I think we really need a whole-of-government approach here. And I think the important issue is that DVA and Defence have played a very important leadership role at a national level, and that shouldn't be forgotten. And one of the tragedies about this sort of fragmentation, I was involved in doing a study of a review of suicides in the Western Australian St John's Ambulance, and one of the conclusions was that in the provision of care to this paramedics, they really just did not have an adequate view of the contemporary evidence. So I think one of the things we really require is having these coordinated organisations that bring knowledge to the service delivery. I mean, and one of the other problems is that there have been some very important developments in treatment guidelines. For example, these treatment guidelines for emergency service personnel in New South Wales. The other side of that, though, is unfortunately the insurer also uses this to limit service provision. You've got to remember that around 60% of these people are not going to get maximal improvement with the evidence-based treatment, and the next interventions are not going to be determined by the treatment guidelines. Yet, because they're not in the treatment guidelines, I've had a number of service providers telling me about how the insurer then will not pay for that next stage in treatment. And you've got to remember that treatment guidelines were put in place by managed care to limit what they had to pay for. So we have to be careful that we don't have this paradoxical effect. So just to conclude, I think at this point, what we really require, and I acknowledge my conflict of interest here, but I guess I'm at the end of my career, but academic clinicians are the culture carriers in healthcare, and getting knowledge into organisations is critical. If bureaucracies don't have the capacity to keep in touch with the emerging literature, there's a real risk of the decline in service delivery standards. You know, we need to have settings where we can train the next generation of clinicians, and the closure of repat hospitals, I think, has put it at significant risk. And, you know, the other fascinating thing is, despite all the advances in neuroscience, they haven't contributed to any advances in treatment, and I think it misses many opportunities. And I think one real shining light for us, however, is Phoenix Australia, because it really is a nodal point for the development of a national network. And I think it's one of the ways in which DVA has really attempted to sustain knowledge and treatment development in this domain. Now, just to finish up, we don't want to be like asbestos. I think people will be shocked to know that there was a Royal Commission in 1906 in the UK that found that asbestos was a cause of deaths. It was only in 2003 an Australian-wide ban was placed on using asbestos in manufacture. We don't want PTSD to be that story. And, you know, I think we're partway through this history, but it does require governments to be actively involved. Thank you.
Look, thank you very much, Sandy. And if we can all please thank the Minister for his address, Professor Asano and Professor Mcfarlane for their addresses this morning.